Я единственный в огне, кто читает свои сны. Поклоняюсь темноте.
I don't try to run home every time I see a thunderstorm on the way. In fact, I'm the sort of person who would rather not be home during a thunderstorm. When this happened, actually, I was living in a college dormitory. It was my sophomore year of school, and I was rooming with a good friend named Peter that I had made during my previous year. So we got along great. I just don't want anyone to think that there was anything at home that kept me from going back. No, I just like being out in the storm. And no, that doesn't mean I like being rained on, because although it likely doesn't bother me as much as it might bother other people, I don't particularly care for it either. What I do like is being at a cafe, a bookstore, hell, even a Walmart during a storm. When I got out of class, I saw that the sky was very, very dark. The pressure was dropping, and I could tell that there would be quite a storm on the way. At that point, I opted to head on over to the bookstore coffee shop that I mostly liked to study in. I figured most students would be headed back to their dorms and the place would be empty. Well, I was definitely right about the place being empty. Other than 2 employees, one on the bookstore register and the other a barista, there was only me and one other person in the place. It wasn't a big store like a Borders, it was a little place. There was a table right by the window that I put my stuff on, and I could watch the storm from there. I barely made it before the rain began to fall, and it fell hard. I was working on my laptop, running some statistics through SPSS, and really having a calm, nice time. It was after quite a bit of work that some movement outside caught my eye. Looking out the window, I was surprised to see my dorm roommate outside in the rain. Didn't even have an umbrella, and he was soaked from head to toe. He was walking along the opposite side of the street from me. He stopped in front of a shop and then looked back and forth a few times. After that, he turned and walked back the way that he had came. I found it weird, but wasn't really sure what to think about the whole thing. Maybe he just got caught in the storm and figured that he was already soaked, so he might as well go about his business. Maybe he turned around and headed back to the dorm. I don't know. About half an hour later, I saw him again. This time, he continued walking in the direction and didn't turn back. Maybe he had forgotten something the first time? I am not really sure. However, the fact that he had been walking around in the rain for such a long period of time without an umbrella had me a little concerned. I got up, walked over to the door of the bookstore cafe, opened it, and looked for him. I didn't see him anywhere. I sent him a text message as soon as I got back in the store, but didn't really expect to hear back from him. I let him know I was in the cafe and wondered what he was up to, walking in the storm. If he was soaked to the bone, then it was pretty unlikely that he would be able to text on his smartphone. I put it out of my mind. After a while, the storm died down a little bit. When it stopped raining, I went and headed back to the dorm room. The sky was still dark, and it was obvious the storm wasn't over, but I felt like going back to the comfort of my room. I was also curious as to what was up with my roommate. When I got back to the dorm, the door was unlocked. I immediately thought that meant my roommate was in there. However, he wasn't. It was very odd that he had left the door unlocked. I've never known him to do that, but everyone makes a mistake every now and then, right? As I was sitting there at my desk, I got a notification for a text message. I looked at my phone and saw that it was Peter. The message was for me not to come back to our room because he had a girl over there. I found the message to be pretty chilling. It was so odd that I got up, went and locked the door. I also put a chain on it. I went back to my desk and looked at my phone. I kept wondering how to reply to the message. It was so weird. I guess I wanted to know what he was up to, so I replied that I wouldn't come back until he told me he was done. I don't know why, but I figured he was up to some sort of game, and I wanted to see what. About half an hour later, the doorknob moved. Immediately, I got up and crept to the door and looked out the peephole. Some guy I'd never seen in my life was trying to get into the room. I went and grabbed my phone in case I needed to call campus police. I heard a key slip into the lock, and this person attempted to open the door. Thank God I had put the chain on. The very moment the chain restrained the door, it quickly closed, and I heard whoever it was actually run down the hallway. The whole situation was too weird, and I called the campus police. I tried texting Peter several times. I never got a response. He never came back to the dorm either. Eventually, a missing person report was filled. This happened 5 years ago, and neither me nor Peter's family have heard anything about him. All we had to go on was his bizarre behavior in the storm and a description I had of the man through the peephole. No one had keys to the room but us two, so whomever that man was, he had gotten Peter's key. Also, his cell phone. Whatever he was coming back to the dorm room for, he was trying to make sure I wasn't there. I've never seen him again either. I do miss Peter quite a bit, but I also wonder if I would have disappeared too if I hadn't been so nervous that I had put the chain on that door. When I was a teenager, I lived quite a decent walk away from school. Both of my parents also worked into the evening. I could probably count on my hand the amount of times my parents may have driven me either to or from school. I was definitely a bus kid. I was pretty active in drama at school. For my freshman and sophomore years in high school, my school would run one extra bus after hours for students who had to stay behind at school for any reason. However, right before my junior year, some budget issues forced them to eliminate certain things. This bus ride was deemed one of those things. You see, most kids lived in town and could walk home after if they needed. The times that I rode this other bus, hell, if there were ever more than 5 students on it at any given time, that would have quite surprised me. So, I had a choice when the bus was eliminated. I could either give up drama, which was not about to happen, I could wait until my parents got off work, which I didn't want to happen, or I could walk home, which is what did happen. I don't want to give you the wrong idea though. It wasn't like I was going off on this 3-hour trek after school each time. It normally took me a little bit over an hour and a half to make the walk. And honestly, I didn't mind it for the most part. However, on the day this story occurred, there had been a storm brewing all day. During each class, I found myself staring out the window more than anything. I kept hoping it would dissipate. When it hadn't by my last class, I had to decide whether I wanted to take the bus home and miss drama or risk walking home in the rain. Quite obviously, I chose to take my chances and walk. I felt I was lucky when I got out of drama. Although the clouds had been looming all day, no rain had actually fallen. I just hoped this could continue a couple hours more so I could get home nice and dry. Just as my luck would have it, though not 20 minutes into my walk, little drops began to fall. When a nice sprinkle was threatening to turn into something worse, I decided to cut through this closed-off property that had an abandoned factory sitting on it. It was not gated off, but it always had plenty of signs on the property telling students not to trespass. However, going through it would shave some time off my walk and hopefully I could beat the downpour. I didn't get halfway through the property when the rain really began to fall. Accepting that I would get wet, but not wanting to get soaked, I made a run straight for the factory. I was originally simply going to stand under the overhang. However, 2 things. I figured out pretty quickly that doing that would not keep me much drier, and I noticed that the door by where I was standing was broken and not boarded shut. I figured I could just go ahead and hang out right inside the door until the rain quieted down, because going into an abandoned building never turns out bad, right? I know a lot of people get kicked from being inside abandoned buildings, but I don't quite get that myself. It was dirty, covered in graffiti with empty beer bottles strewn about. Undoubtedly, this meant it was a popular place for teenagers to go to drink. I thought maybe I'd actually see if some of my friends might be interested in doing this. It was then that I thought I heard something coming from inside the factory. Immediately after, there was a deafening crack of thunder. I heard it, but didn't give it much mind the first time. But then, I heard it again. It sounded like something was moving in an adjacent room. I told myself it was likely a snake or a rat, but I also realized the storm was rather loud, actually. Whatever I was hearing was definitely bigger than that. I considered simply running back into the storm. It was really coming down now, however. I would have been soaked in an instant, and for all I knew, what I was hearing was probably nothing big. Hell, it may have been a cat, and I decided that it was probably a feline. There was another ear-destroying crack of thunder, and then I definitely heard what sounded like an awful moan or something. I thought that I must have wandered into something I probably wish I hadn't. I almost thought about leaving and going into the rain, but when I heard the noise again, I decided to follow it and to see what was going on. Wow, my heart was beating so hard as I walked around the corner. I saw the open door to the room, and after taking a moment to catch my breath, I turned the corner and looked in. I was freaked to see a girl about my age in the room. Her hands and feet were bound and she had a gag in her mouth. She looked at me with pure terror in her face. After taking a moment to recover, I ran over to her and began untying her. When I ungagged her, she gave me a hug like she knew me. She then got up and insisted that we leave the building right then. I tried to get her to explain, but she ran past me. We both ran into the rain, immediately getting soaked. We were closer to the school than my house, so we ran back there when she called the police. The girl had been abducted by 3 guys around my age. In fact, 3 guys who went to my school. She didn't know why they had left her there in the factory, but they tied her up and dropped her off there. She was expecting them to come back for God knows what, but I guess fortunately I got there before them. I don't really want to go into what happened afterward. Although no one was physically hurt, the girl was seriously mentally hurt. However, no one was punished for what happened either. I hate thinking about that. Kids always find people to which they ascribe attributes that come purely from the imagination. I think most people make up stories about people that they really don't know, and most people don't ever find out if they are. When I was growing up, there was a man who lived across the street. No one really knew much about him, or at least we didn't know anything real about him. He was sort of the neighborhood boogeyman, but it was quite understandable if you looked at his house and his behavior. The house was old. It had been painted in forever. A few of the windows had old plastic covering them, which had been there for a long time. His lawn was dead. It was mostly dirt with a few scraggly bits of vegetation here and there. There was a dead tree in the front yard, and an old tire strangely hanging from its only branch. For the entire time he lived there, it was always there. Of course, no kids had ever played on it, since kids would rarely, if ever, dare to go into his yard. In addition, there were some old toys and decorations in the yard. An old tricycle was on his porch. There was a plastic reindeer lying on its side. And there was more things like that in the yard. The man's name was Mr. Ryan. I'm not aware of what his first name was, because at the time, I would have never even wondered what an adult's first name was. He was an older man, probably in his late 60s. He was bald, except for a little bit of gray on the side and back, almost like Patrick Stewart. However, Mr. Ryan was not affable like Patrick Stewart. He always looked especially mean, and I could never imagine anyone wanting to approach him. He never talked to anyone, rarely left his home. We all assumed he was retired. Naturally, there were all sorts of stories about Mr. Ryan. The most popular one that he had killed both his wife and son many years earlier. He had gone off on a technicality and was ostracized by the community. I doubt this was true though, as I had only heard it from other children and never an adult. People would often hear sounds of banging and power tools when they walked by his house. Often this would be at night while there was blue light shining from his windows. Odd that a man would do that sort of work in the middle of the night, but of course we didn't know what kind of work it was because he never talked to anyone. When I was 12 years old, I was a latchkey kid. One day the school bus dropped me off when a thunderstorm was looming. Quickly I ran into the house and locked the door behind, mostly happy that I was not getting wet. About an hour later, the storm finally broke. It was almost like it was nighttime, but it was occasionally lit up by a bright flash of lightning, followed by deafening thunder. I don't know if 12 years old is too old to be afraid of thunderstorms, but I know that I was pretty scared. I always locked the door when I got home. I got on the couch, wrapped myself up in a blanket, and tried to simply watch television and forget the fact that it was storming outside. Only maybe 20 minutes after the storm began, the lights and TV flickered before the electricity went out. The house fell silent. I was terrified, but I kept telling myself that there was no issue. I don't know exactly what made me do it, other than the fact that people sometimes feel a tendency to check outside when the electricity goes out to see if it's just them or the entire neighborhood. But I got up the nerve to get up and walked over to the window by the front door. Looking out, I could see that across the street, Mr. Ryan's lights were on his porch. He had electricity. I looked at the house to the side, and also their porch lights were on. It was just me. In a moment I will never forget, a strike of lightning lit up the sky and the entire neighborhood. And in that moment, I saw Mr. Ryan walking up the sidewalk on the side of my house. It was only for a brief moment, but he was on our property. Coming from the back of the house, he got shut off our electricity. Frightened, I ran over to the couch and curled back up into my blanket. Not long after, I heard someone trying to turn my doorknob. It was locked, but it continued to rattle a little bit. I hadn't hooked the bolt though. Gathering up every nerve I had, I ran over to the door quickly and bolted it and ran back to the couch. There was another flash of lightning, and I saw someone at the door through the window. I had no doubt it was Mr. Ryan, and I knew he was trying to get into the house. I grabbed the phone and called my dad. He told me that he would call the police and hurry home. He told me to go and lock myself in his bedroom. I did that. I was on the bed and scared of every noise I heard. Eventually, I did hear the door open. I was terrified when I heard someone running up the stairs. However, I felt relieved when it was my dad telling me to open the door. When he had arrived, Mr. Ryan had already left. He hadn't tried to break into the house, I guess. I doubt the police, when they arrived, even believed me. They knew about the stories people told about the old man. However, my dad informed them that someone had opened the power box outside and thrown the switch that cut off the electricity. Because of that, they went over and spoke to Mr. Ryan. My father also had a talk with him. They never told me what they talked about, and Mr. Ryan never came back to the house. The very few times I ever saw him though, he would always give me a look that made my blood run cold. I guess part of me always believed the stories about him were made up, but after that day, I was convinced he was up to something. Fortunately, my parents taught me well about locking the door when I got home, or I might be telling a much different story, if I was telling a story at all.